the introductions. I'd like to introduce Paige Ulrey. She's a senior deputy prosecuting attorney for the King County Prosecutor's Office. She graduated from Amherst College and Northeastern University School of Law in 2001. She was appointed to the position of elder abuse prosecutor in her office, and in that position, she prosecutes cases of neglect, financial exploitation, sexual and physical assault, and homicide, and she co-leads her office's elder abuse multidisciplinary team. Paige conducts trainings on elder abuse prosecution and investigation across the country. And I'm also very pleased to introduce Eileen Alexander, who is a senior deputy prosecuting attorney for King County Prosecutor's Office in the Elder Abuse, Neglect, and Exploitation Unit. She graduated from the University of Washington for both her undergraduate and law degrees, and she began her legal career at the Washington State Attorney General's Office, Medicaid Fraud Unit, and has been with the King County Prosecutor's Office since 2014. Prior to a career in law, Eileen worked in the financial services area as a banker and a corporate trainer, and she was a longtime volunteer with the Washington State Alzheimer's Association and served on their board of directors. So I hope you can see that they both have tremendous expertise to share with us on scams targeting people with cognitive impairment. And welcome and thank you both for agreeing to speak.
Barb, thank you so much for having us, and thank you all for attending. We're really grateful to be here. And before we get started, I also just wanted to thank Barb for the amount of time and care she spent in helping us get ready for this. It was really a pleasure to work with her, so thank you. So Eileen and I are going to be talking about scams, as you can see, specifically ones targeting people with older adults with cognitive impairment. And we've got a lot of slides, and we may or may not get through all of them, but the handout will be available to you all if it isn't already. So if we don't get through them all, you'll at least have it as a reference. So let's go ahead and get started.
So our King County Elder Abuse, Neglect, and Exploitation Unit consists of 3 full-time prosecutors, Paige and myself, and a third, 2 financial analysts, a part-time victim advocate, and we prosecute the cases for King County regarding elder financial exploitation, neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and homicides. We also do training in the community, training of first responders, the medical community, and members of the public. And our goal, in addition to the individual cases that we prosecute, is to improve the systemic response to elder abuse. And we recognize that King County is unique in the fact that we have a dedicated unit in the prosecutor's office for elder abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And not every prosecutor's office is fortunate enough to be able to carve out a dedicated elder abuse prosecutor. I know that Paige has started this unit, I can't remember how many years ago.
2001.
2001. So we've been very fortunate to be able to build this practice and build this expertise since then.
So this is our agenda for today. We haven't really presented in depth on scams like this before. And I think it's because we historically have prosecuted a lot of cases of theft by trusted people, usually powers of attorney or someone in some kind of trust relationship, and fewer cases of financial exploitation by strangers or scams by trusted people. But as our practice has developed, we've become increasingly focused on scams. And I think that's because we're getting better able to respond to those cases. And also because I think they're growing in numbers with the aging population and for a lot of other reasons. So it's really an important issue affecting older adults. And we're just so honored to be here and talk to you all about it. We also hope that you will ask questions as we go, and we'll let Barb sort of figure out which questions should be answered, during the course of the presentation versus at the end. But I think the more responsive we can be to your questions and concerns, the more helpful we'll be. So please don't hesitate to type in the chat or in the question and answer section if anything comes up for you as we go. So we're going to talk about a case example, which is actually going to be woven throughout the presentation. And then we'll move into talking about financial exploitation generally, and then specific kinds of scams that we see in these three categories. Then we'll move into talking about dementia and cognitive capacity. And we recognize that you all are much better experts on the subject than we are. But we want to bring our perspective into this because it's so important that I think we have a mutual understanding with healthcare providers about what it is and how it affects the older people we work with. And then we'll conclude by talking about how we feel you can help us in making sure we try to stop some of the exploitation that's happening in the state and in the country in our work. So Mariana is the first case we want to talk about. And Mariana was a case I tried a number of years ago. She came to our attention when she was in her 80s. Her husband had died a few years earlier. She was retired and lived alone in her own house that she owned with a mortgage outside of the Seattle area. She had 2 grown children, but she wasn't very close to either one of them. She was estranged from her daughter, actually, and then she saw her son only infrequently because he lived fairly far away from her. And this is a picture of her with her grandson. And Mariana met a woman named Janet Baumel through her neighbor. And Janet Baumel worked as a home organization person. And so she was organizing the home of this elderly woman who lived next door to Mariana. And Janet was very friendly to Mariana and very interested in her. She told her she was a single mother with 2 teenage kids. She was barely making ends meet is what she told Mariana. And in fact, she did have substantial credit card debt. She was also just incredibly empathetic to Mariana, and Mariana felt like in meeting her that she'd made a real friend, which she needed. Janet pursued the friendship with her, and after a few months, I believe, was stopping by Mariana's house almost daily. And around those first months of their friendship, Mariana, her daughter, from whom she's estranged, was diagnosed with breast cancer. It was a very aggressive cancer that ended up getting worse very quickly. And Mariana got re-involved with her daughter, with her daughter's life, and began to help her granddaughter, who was the daughter of this woman with cancer, provide care to her. And so she kind of repaired this relationship with her daughter, which was wonderful for her. But soon her daughter became very, very ill and she died. And Mariana was heartbroken, of course, by her loss. And I think even more so because she had such a damaged relationship with her for so long. By the time her daughter died, Janet was very close to Mariana, and really Mariana felt like she had another daughter in Janet. And eventually Janet began helping Mariana with her bills. And Mariana told her she had some trouble handling her money, and she thought it was because her husband had always handled their money. But Janet became her trusted confidant, and eventually Mariana asked her to become her power of attorney and also the executor of her estate. So she put her in her will as well. And it wasn't until about 3 years into the friendship when Janet began to ask Mariana for money. And this is the list of things she told Mariana about why she needed this money. She said she needed it to feed and clothe her children. She talked about her son having a drug addiction, needing money for his treatment. She talked about her own abuse as a child and that she needed money for therapies for herself and for medical care for herself. And then she talked about a new business she was starting and how she needed money for this new business. And she promised Mariana that the checks that Mariana wrote to her were just loans, and she promised her she would pay her back. And she talked frequently about the fact that she would soon be getting a large insurance settlement from a car accident that she'd been in. She talked about this new company she was working for, and that she would soon be making a lot of money with this company. So Mariana believed with every check that she wrote to Janet that she'd be getting that money back one day. And she really felt like she was investing in their friendship. Over time, as Janet became more confident that Mariana was going to be willing to agree to every request she made from her money, she asked for greater amounts of money and also became more emotional and more dramatic. And with each request, Mariana agreed. And she basically wrote her a check for whatever Janet asked for. And by the following year, so this is now 4 years into the relationship, Mariana had been drained of most of her accounts because she was lending this money to Janet. And as this went on and Mariana sort of got deeper and deeper into this hole with Janet, Janet was very clear to her she shouldn't tell anyone, and she didn't want to tell anyone because she became very ashamed of this, of the fact that she was doing this, and very worried that her family would find out and be critical of her for trusting Janet as much as she did. So she didn't tell anybody about it. And eventually Mariana ran out of money completely. And at the time, her house needed a new roof. And because Janet had sounded like she was going to be able to repay her very shortly, she had the work done, relying on Janet's promises to repay her. When the payment was due for the roof, Mariana called Janet and begged her to repay her. And she said, I got this huge bill now. I'm trusting that you're going to give me this money back, and I need to pay this roofer. So please give me this money. And Janet at that point disappeared and stopped returning her calls. And eventually Mariana's desperation grew to the point where she had to call her granddaughter Amy, and tell her what was going on, because she felt like she had no way she could pay for this roof. She was completely out of money, and she was now in debt because of all the money she had lent to Janet. And Amy learned, in looking into her grandmother's accounts, that over 3 years, Mariana had written 25 checks to Janet, totaling over $217,000. And that Mariana herself had written those checks. So even though Janet did have this power of attorney, it was Mariana's handwriting, Mariana's signature on the checks, and Mariana admitted that she was the one who agreed to give Janet this money. She also found out that Mariana had taken out credit card advances and reverse mortgage to lend more money to Janet. So distraught over her grandmother's situation, Amy called 911 and made a report to the police.
We're going to come back to the story about Marianne and Janet. But we want to talk about the financial exploitation and scams involving older adults. I want to start by saying anyone can fall for a scam. And it isn't just older people that are targeted. It isn't just older people that are losing money to scammers. But older people, particularly older people with cognitive deficits, are particularly vulnerable to exploitation. So when we're talking about elder financial exploitation, we're talking about the illegal use of an older person's money or property or resources for someone else's benefit. And we see that when a fiduciary, someone with power of attorney, or an accountant or a guardian, is leveraging that access to that older person's money and using it for their own benefit. We see that when people are stealing the older person's checks or credit cards or purses and other valuables. We see that with undue influence, where the perpetrator is manipulative and kind of controls and takes over the will of that older person. And then, of course, we see with scams, which are those fraudulent or deceptive acts or operations in order to get somebody to hand over money. Powers of attorney are oftentimes those trusted individuals who have that label of power of attorney. And so everyone kind of automatically assumes that they're trustworthy people and that they're doing everything on the up and up. The other assumption is that because someone is a power of attorney, they have carte blanche. They have the power to do whatever they want with the assets of that other person, which is simply not true. And these are oftentimes the cases that are hardest to get referred because there is this assumption that the power of attorney can do what they want, but they're also the easiest cases for us as prosecutors to prove oftentimes because there is an affirmative duty to use those funds for the benefit of that older person.
And we're adding that here, even though they're not, abusive power of attorney isn't a scam. Obviously, we want you guys to know about this because it's another area where there's just so much misunderstanding about what's legal and what's criminal and what's not. But abuse of power of attorney, so if you have somebody who is a power of attorney for an adult who drains their accounts and spends that person's money on themselves rather than for the benefit of the elder, as Eileen was saying, that is theft. So please make sure if you hear about a case like that, that you report it to police. That's a separate training issue. We'll talk about that later, but if you don't get the response that you want and you're in King County, please call us.
We've kind of categorized the scams in 3 different ways. And the first is the scams by the trusted persons, which we're talking about with Mariana and Jana Brahma. What typically happens is that trusted person, that family member, that new friend, takes the elder's assets based on lies, based on a promise to invest their money, based on a promise to repay the money because it's just a loan, or lies about the purpose, what they need the money for, or a promise to become romantically involved or marry the elder person. They can be long-time trusted persons, or they can be kind of new people in the person's life.
And this is just another area where there's a lot of misunderstanding, and it's why we chose this case to present to you all, because a lot of people don't realize that this is criminal, that lying to someone and getting them to give you money based on a promise to marry them or a promise to repay them, if you're consciously lying to do that, that is criminal. And so we really are wanting to, for everyone to be aware of that, so we get those cases referred to us.
We do tend to think of scams as things that are perpetrated by anonymous people on the internet. And it can be that for sure, but it can also be something that's much more personal. We also have scams by strangers, but that occur in person. Oftentimes the stranger will target the elder person and promise to or enter into a contract to repair a home, or repair cars, or do landscaping, or be that financial consultant and invest the elder's assets. Again, we see the romance scams with in-person strangers that approach an elder in person. We do have a scam that's quite frequent, and that is a contractor scam. So perpetrator, a stranger, approaches a home that appears in disrepair, or they know is owned by an elder, either by watching the neighborhood and seeing who comes out to get the mail or who comes out to get in their car. They will allege that there's damage to the home. I'm a roofer. I can tell that there's a problem with your chimney or your roof, or I do cement work and I can see that you have a problem with your driveway. And they offer to fix that problem for the elder who maybe physically can't identify the problem, can't see up to the chimney, or can't repair those things themselves. And they insist on being paid in cash, which is a big red flag. And then they continue to do work on this house, or do work on this house. And they continue to allege that there are necessary repairs. Now it's your foundation, now it's your siding. And again, continuing to insist on only being paid in cash. And the result is extensive damage to the property, and tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars gone because it was all paid in cash.
And this is another kind of case where a lot of people feel like, oh, there's no point in reporting this to the police. Those people will never catch them. You know, the victim may not remember who they were even. But I would encourage you all, if you hear about a case like this, to please report it to the police. We had a case last year where the daughter of the victim did report it to the police. Her dad had turned over about $400,000 to these scammers. And the detective jumped on the case, and we were able to get $200,000 back to the victim through his quick action, getting search warrants and finding out where the money was and grabbing it before it was too late. So, and again, with these kinds of cases as well, if you hear about a case like this and the police are not responding and it's in King County, please feel free to reach out to Eileen and we will connect with the police and talk to them about it and hopefully get things moving.
There are some red flags with these kinds of contractor scams. One I mentioned was being paid in cash. One is having someone just knocking on your door, offering to make these repairs for you. So if you're hearing about those kinds of stories, those are red flags and should be kind of followed up on and questioned. There's another type of in-person scam, and I want to tell you just a little bit about a real case that we prosecuted. Giorgio Stevens would sit in a parking lot of a grocery store and identify cars that were pulling in, driven by older people. And he would walk over and he would lean down and say, "Oh, there's something wrong with your car." And he would literally pop the bumper and do damage to the car and say that your car isn't safe if you drive it like this, but I happen to work for AAA. I happen to work for Jiffy Lube. I happen to work for a garage, and I can repair it for you while you do your grocery shopping. And he would have a debit card scanner, and he would charm them and chat with them, and they would hand over their debit card and put in their PIN number. And he'd say, "Well, I'm just going to charge you for the parts, and you go do your grocery shopping." And they would not even realize they didn't get the debit card back. And before they knew it, not only is their car damaged, but their debit card had been used, and Mr. Stevens stole thousands of dollars from people. There were 17 known victims. We think that there were many, many more. And we'll talk a little bit about why people don't report these crimes when they're a victim. He did end up pleading guilty to 17 counts of theft. We had a detective who noticed the pattern, and because so many elders did come forward, we were able to put together that case. But these are the types of stranger scams that can be small dollar amounts or large dollar amounts, but they are in person, which also for us, it implies a risk of physical danger for those victims. We also have scams by strangers online or over the phone, and those are the ones that we hear about a lot, I think, on the news. There's the scam either online or by phone, offering an opportunity to win money, lottery scams. There's online dating, romance scams. There's the computer online hacking. You've been hacked. You need to give me your password, and I'll help you, get your computer back to your control. We also have a lot of impersonator scams. People calling, impersonating a grandchild who needs money emergently. Calls and online scams that represent that they're from the FBI or from the FDIC. They're from the bank fraud department. They're from law enforcement. We're going to talk about your case.
Yeah, I prosecuted a case where a woman was basically calling people. She got the names of older people from using a phone book, and in the phone book she would look through the names and usually choose females with names that sounded like the person was older, like Gertrude or I can't remember, but she had like Opal. She was able to sort of key in on the likelihood of someone being an older person. I think also because their name was in the phone book at all, but also because of the type of name they had. And she would call them and pretend to be from their bank. And then she would tell them they'd been the victim of fraud and their bank account was being drained. And in their panic, the person she was talking to would turn over the name of their bank, their account numbers, their passwords. And then this perpetrator would use that information to then access the accounts of these victims. It was really a horrible, just incredibly cruel thing to do to people. And she had many, many victims. We ended up charging her with 44 counts of theft. Actually, we charged her with more than that, but she ended up pleading guilty to 44 counts of theft. And that was 44 different victims that we were able to find and identify and then prosecute her on. And so, I mean, again, like the car bumper case that Eileen talked about, these are just cases where some of these perpetrators are out there and really have become very good at taking advantage of people. And it's just the damage that these people can do is enormous. And I just also want to point out that not all the victims of these obviously are older. There are a lot of younger people who are scammed as well. It's just that older people tend to be scammed more often and seem to be more vulnerable, oftentimes due to dementia, as we were talking about.
The AARP has a lot of resources about scams and what can be done about scams, but these are some of the common methods of these remote stranger scams that we kind of hear about: the computer pop-ups, the fake social media profiles, the phony businesses and charities. There's also a high likelihood that once someone has been scammed through one of these online or phone scams, that they end up on a list and they become the target of multiple more scams. So someone can fall the victim to one scam and then become the target for every scam out there, and sometimes are hit multiple times and victimized multiple times. There often there's urgency involved. You're being defrauded right now, and you need to give me your password information so I can stop your bank account from being drained. Or I'm your grandchild and I'm in dire need of money. Please send it immediately. There's also secrecy around a lot of these scams, and sometimes threats, sometimes flattery and charm, and that kind of I'll mention again the romance scams that induce someone to want to help. So the AARP is a good kind of resource for a lot of this scam information, particularly the online and phone scams.
So what we know is that elder financial exploitation is a growing crisis. Older people hold the majority of the wealth in the US, and financial exploitation costs older people $28.3 billion per year. And my guess is that that's an underestimate. But of that amount, 72% is stolen by someone the elder knows. So some of that is through these personal scams that Eileen and I talked about. Some of it is also through abuse of powers of attorney and outright theft. But it's fair to say that older people are incredibly vulnerable to exploitation. And then as far as internet crimes are concerned, another growing area, according to the FBI, over 100,000 reports of internet financial crimes against people in 2023, with total losses over $3,400,000, significant increase over the year before, and really a significant amount of loss for each victim. And 5,920 victims lost over $100,000 of those reports. So it can be incredibly damaging to people.
And that is not, that's probably a gross underestimate, because most elder financial exploitation is not reported out of every 44 cases actually comes to light. So why aren't these cases reported? There's a lot of reasons. There can be involved professionals who don't report because it's difficult to determine whether something is financial exploitation or whether it's the elder person's choice and they have the ability to make that choice, and that's the choice they're making. We have, as adults, the right to make our own decisions, whether those are good decisions or bad decisions. And determining whether or not someone is able to make that choice or is being given the information, the accurate information in order to make that choice, it's difficult.
In Mariana's case, I can chime in, Eileen, that she had a financial advisor. She had also, she went to someone to apply for a reverse mortgage, who watched, looked at her account balances. A lot of financial professionals were involved with her, and no one ever reported what was happening.
There's also lack of training just in general about what is financial exploitation, how dementia can appear or not appear, and mandatory reporting obligations. There's a general concern about not wanting to insert themselves into the elder's life in that way and start taking over making decisions. Sometimes there's a professional relationship with the elder, and you don't want to lose that business. And there's a fear of liability. We talked a little bit about mandatory reporting, but that's oftentimes the professionals in the elder's life who has been scammed are not reporting that financial exploitation. The studies that are out there, and there aren't that many, but the studies that are out there have pretty grim results, that 50% of the victims in a financial exploitation study in New York State were unaware of their financial mistreatment. And only 2 of the reports of those cases were actually made by the victims. Oh, 2%, sorry. That means that the people around that elder really need to be paying attention in order to identify the financial exploitation and then report it. There's a lot of reasons why the victims are reluctant to report or don't report. I think it boils down to a fear of what will happen to them if they report, the concern that they will, someone will decide that I can't take care of myself, and then I'll have to relinquish control and independence, fear of retaliation by the perpetrator, and fear that, and I think this was the case in Mariana's case, that if I report, then I have no hope of getting that money back. Right now, it's still a loan, and so I have hope that I'll get repaid. But if I report it, I won't get that money. And of course, the one of the biggest factors is dementia. They're just not aware that they're being exploited.
And many of these factors, I think, were present for Mariana in that case. So we're going to go back to Mariana briefly and just give you the next step in what happened in her case. After Amy called 911, there was a response by the police. The initial patrol officer who responded didn't really know what to do with the case. I've never seen a case like that before. But she tried to investigate it, but her sergeant refused to assign it to a detective. So it languished with her for about a year. And then thankfully, Amy just kept complaining and calling the police department and saying, this is not okay. My grandmother was a victim of a crime. We need to do something. So finally, a detective was assigned. And she did begin an investigation. And this is just a list of what she did. During the course of her investigation. She obviously took statements from a lot of different people, including Mariana and Amy. She got search warrants for both Janet Bommel's bank records and for Mariana's bank records. And she looked at the reasons that Mariana had been given by Janet about why Janet needed money. She got Janet's medical records, her son's drug treatment billing records, accident reports, her employment records, because as part of this criminal investigation, she had to figure out, were these things that Janet was telling Mariana true? Because if they were true, then there's no deception. And then Mariana was, freely choosing to give her this money. But if they were lies, then it shifts and then it becomes potentially criminal. She also got Mariana's medical records, and she requested a capacity evaluation of Mariana. And I asked her to do that because I was worried that there was more going on with Mariana than was evident in talking to her. In talking to her, she was very clear. She was very well-spoken and unhesitating in her speech. I didn't notice anything being wrong with her, but the whole story was just so concerning. And I just felt like it was very likely that even if nothing was wrong with her, I wanted to know, because I felt like if there was dementia, then the jury should hear about that, because that's part of what was going on here. It's part of potentially why Janet had been so successful in exploiting. So we got a capacity evaluation of Mariana. So we're going to talk a little bit about this. And I know, again, this is your subject area far more than mine. So forgive me if I am ignorant about this. This is just based on my experience. And please chime in if you all have comments on this. Someone said 3 million or 3 billion as far as losses.
It's billion.
It's billion. Yeah. So what Eileen and I see, and what I think some studies also bear out, is that dementia and loneliness are the two primary risk factors for elder financial exploitation. And this was true certainly. And we also know that almost 50% of people with dementia experience some form of abuse, whether it's financial exploitation, neglect, or physical or sexual abuse.
That's a very halting statistic, that if you are a medical provider, that if you have a patient with dementia, it is just as likely that they will have been or will be experiencing or are currently experiencing some sort of abuse. That half of your patients with dementia will go through that.
So we deal with the question of capacity all the time, because for us, it is central to how we decide whether a case should be brought and whether a crime was committed. Because inevitably we are looking at whether a victim, an alleged victim, consented to whatever the act is at issue. So we are looking at whether the person had capacity to make the decision that is sort of the central to the case. And this is how we define capacity in our cases. I know you all know this much better than we do. But for us, when we're looking at capacity, we're looking at specifically, did they have capacity to decide to give this person their money, to consent to a sexual act, to refuse medical care? Those are the ways capacity comes up in our caseload when we're talking about financial exploitation or neglect or sexual assault. And what we know about financial capacity is that it's often one of the first things that goes during the course of a dementia. So a lot of our detectives who work on these cases know to talk when they interview a victim, to ask them if they can look at their bills to see if they're paying their bills, to look at their checkbook register if they use one, to see if they're really tracking the checks they're writing and properly subtracting their balance and really able to manage their finances properly. And there's a study recently done in New York that found that 1 year before actual diagnosis of Alzheimer's, people are 17.2% more likely to be late with their mortgage payments and over 34% more likely to be delinquent on their credit card bills. So I think that is such an important fact for all of us.
It's a red flag to look for.
And for us, as I was saying, capacity is crucial. And that's because when we get a case, especially a financial case, the number one most common defense that's raised or explanation that's given us by alleged perpetrators is that this is what the victim wanted. I was the one who was there for her. She wanted me to have all of her money. He loved me more than he loved his other kids. He wanted me to inherit his estate. The money was a loan. I was going to pay him back. This is how these cases come to us, with these explanations often given to us. So we have to decide if they're true or not. And because again, as Eileen said earlier, everyone has the right to do what they want to with their money. And so we have to be incredibly cautious when we consider these cases and look at all the surrounding circumstances, including capacity. And we can't figure out whether an elder consented unless we know whether they had the capacity to consent. So inevitably, we're getting capacity evaluations, we're getting records from primary care providers, really getting all the evidence we can to determine whether or not the person had capacity at the time of the alleged crime.
What we've also found is that even though someone has dementia, if they have experienced something that has been traumatic to them, they often retain that memory of that event with more detail than other events in their lives. We often have had victims with dementia who are able to take the stand, who are able to understand and answer questions and can testify effectively, even though they don't remember every detail, or even if they get some things wrong, because they can retain that traumatic event with such detail. The traumatic events with financial exploitation are oftentimes when they realize their money was gone, and they can remember that moment and describe that moment in a lot of detail.
And we know that sadly, we see a lot of cases of primary care providers who miss cases of dementia in their patients. And what we found is that usually that's because they have not had training on diagnosing dementia. They're primary care providers, not geriatricians. They are often still over-reliant on the mini mental status exam, which, as you all know, is a very blunt instrument and really does not pick up impairment of executive function very well. And so what we find is that PCPs are much better and much more able to pick up dementia with SLUMS tests or MOCA tests or the IDA or some other more sensitive screening tests. They also miss cases because patients with dementia, as you all know, often don't recognize it in themselves and may well be very much in denial. There's also, it's not a fun diagnosis to be given the fact that there's no good treatment options at this point. So it's, I think a lot of doctors don't have the time and also don't have the desire to go down that road with patients who aren't interested in pursuing it. And then we know that patients with higher education and verbal skills can mask dementia more easily. So going back to our case example, we had a capacity evaluation of Mariana done by the Geriatric Regional Assessment Team in King County. And this was back in 2012 when this happened. And she scored 19 out of 30 on the SLUMS test and 11 out of 18 on the frontal assessment battery. So pretty significant impairment of her executive function. She also had deficits in the clock drawing and had absolutely no insight into her impairment. She did not believe she was suffering from any dementia at all. And she was diagnosed with dementia in the US. This is a picture of her clock drawing in which she was instructed to draw a clock showing the time is 10 minutes after 11. So going on to the investigation, what those search warrants that the detective executed found were that Janet had not been in an accident. It was not true that she was going to be getting a big insurance settlement. That she worked for a company that was not going to be paying her a lot of money. There was no likely large income that she would be getting that would allow her to repay Mariana. And her bank records were particularly telling. And what we saw was that she was spending Mariana's money on a lot of trips, on clothes. She was a big fan of Coldwater Creek and bought very expensive clothes with Mariana's money. She went out to eat a lot, and then she spent a lot of money on spiritual healers of some kind. And she had a lot of debt and unpaid credit cards. We also got her medical records because she had told Mariana that she needed money for her treatment. And they showed that the only medical treatment she was getting was for a Geriatric thyroid, and she had insurance. As far as her son's drug treatment, we did find out that he had gotten drug treatment, that it was all paid for by the state. So pretty much every story she told Mariana about what she needed the money for and that she would repay her was a lie. So based on that, we did file charges against Janet. We initially filed one count of theft. And when she wouldn't settle, we filed multiple counts as we were getting ready for trial. So ultimately, she was charged with 12 counts of felony level theft. And this is what we had to prove in order for the jury to find her guilty of each of those counts. We charged for 12 of the specific checks, the larger checks that Mariana had written. And we had to show that they were obtained by the color or aid of deception by Janet, and that Janet intended to deprive her of the money. And either for theft in the second degree, it was the money had to be over $750, and for theft in the first degree, over $5,000. So that was what the jury had to decide, was if we'd proven each of those charges. And this is a list of witnesses that we called, and this is pretty typical in our cases. If we have a victim, we call her or him. We called her granddaughter, Mariana's granddaughter. We called the capacity evaluator who evaluated Mariana, the detective, the patrol officer, and then the financial analyst who works for us, who analyzes all the bank records and really tells the jury the story of what happened to Mariana's money and how Janet spent the money. And Janet, she called her son as a witness, her daughter, who just basically told the jury what a good mother she was. And I think of greatest interest to us was that she called Mariana's treating physician because he had not noticed any dementia in Mariana. They felt it was relevant to show that Mariana was just fine and she knew exactly what she was doing. On cross-examination, he admitted he had no knowledge of capacity screening tools. He was not aware of the slums and MOCA. He had no awareness of the MMSE, the deficits with the MMSE. And he had also ignored some red flags that were mentioned in her medical records. She'd actually been the victim of a number of different scams before she was exploited by Janet. And there were some other things in there that were concerning that he just didn't have the training to know to pay attention to. So this is what the defense attorneys claimed at trial, was that Marianne had given the money willingly, that one day Janet would pay that money back, even though there was absolutely no basis to believe that she would ever have the money to do so. And that there were some of the things that Janet said that were true, like she needed money to pay her rent, but that was because she was spending her money on restaurants and trips instead of on paying the rent. And she said that Mariana, they claimed that Mariana didn't really rely on Janet's lies because they were such good friends that she would have given her the money. So that was generally the defense that was raised at trial. And the jury came back guilty.
It didn't work. The defense didn't work.
And they convicted of 10 of the 12 counts for reasons I won't bore you with. But they essentially believed Mariana, and they believed that Janet absolutely knew what she was doing. They found her guilty. So Janet went to prison for 43 months, which for us is a significant victory. And some of the lessons we learned from this case were the importance of looking beyond, looking beyond what's apparent consent. And that's particularly when we see cases of alleged financial exploitation where the older adults made unusual, substantial gifts of their assets. We need to look for deception by the perpetrator. We need to look for cognitive impairment of the victim. And we need to look to see if the victim was being unduly influenced, so really manipulated by the perpetrator.
And when the diagnosis, when we don't have a diagnosis of dementia, but there are cognitive, there's cognitive decline and cognitive deficits. It of course impacts the victim's ability to recognize red flags, and they may agree to do things that they normally wouldn't have agreed to, which is what really is the crux of what makes them so vulnerable when it comes to cognitive impairment, is that they are not able to recognize the red flags that they once may have been able to recognize. And that's why the perpetrators can take such easy advantage.
It also showed us, and this was a while ago, as you saw, that how much we need trained and dedicated elder abuse detectives and prosecutors to handle these cases. The cases are complicated. They deal with issues like capacity and financial analysis and guardianships and conservatorships and powers of attorney. A lot of different issues come into play in these cases. And when you're a detective who's never been trained on that, and you've been trained to investigate homicides and assaults, it feels overwhelming to get a case like this. So in order for us to really successfully dedicate ourselves to this problem, we've got to get these trained people in these positions. It's absolutely crucial. And we also need a multidisciplinary response to these cases. Eileen's going to talk to you more about King County's multidisciplinary team, but I think that it is absolutely essential to our beginning to respond better to these cases, both for purposes of stopping perpetrators and charging them, but also for purposes of protecting older people who are vulnerable. And then we need better training for healthcare providers on capacity screening and older financial exploitation, because they are oftentimes the first ones to see these cases and in a unique position to be able to get more information from vulnerable patients. And then we learned that elder financial exploitation is devastating, and we continue to learn that lesson with every case that we get. What happened to Mariana as a result of this case was that she had to declare bankruptcy. She had to sell her home and move into an assisted living facility. And she really lost trust in other people. And I think what resulted in the most damage to her was she lost trust in herself. And it was extremely devastating to her in many ways.
With these financial exploitation cases, the elder person oftentimes has no ability to live at the previous standard of living. It can just wipe someone out. They're not in a position to be able to go back to work and start earning some money again. It can cause the victim to have to, like Mariana, sell her home. and move into long-term care. The retirement that they had worked their whole lives for and saved for is no longer a possibility. We see a lot of victims needing to go on Medicaid where they would never have imagined that they would have been needing to go on Medicaid. It can cause devastation to families. And there is just a long lasting damage to a person's dignity when they are taken in by someone, whether it's a personal friend or the stranger in the parking lot or someone online or on the phone. It is devastating to their dignity. The abuse, neglect, and exploitation, even if it's mild, has devastating effects on that individual's health and can increase deaths in the elderly by 300%, which is just a staggering statistic.
And Eileen and I experience that a lot in our cases where we will have a case that we get, and usually it takes a couple of years by the time the case is investigated, and the length of time it sort of languishes, frankly, in the criminal justice system. And oftentimes we lose our victims before we get to trial. But we are usually able to proceed anyway, using statements they've made and using other sort of circumstantial evidence. But it's a very sad fact about the cases.
So there is good news that we are improving our ability to respond to scams. One of those ways, as Paige mentioned, is a multidisciplinary approach to elder abuse and exploitation. King County has an elder abuse multidisciplinary team. We are in our 6th year now, approaching our 7th year now. Yeah. The participants in the multidisciplinary team are really from all over. We have adult protective services and AAA case managers. We have people who work in the elder, work with elders and in the aging community. We also have law enforcement. We have financial analysts. We have the geriatricians. We have a number of people who can approach a difficult situation, a difficult case from a number of different perspectives. The multidisciplinary team can help cover the costs of capacity evaluations if the victim or victim's family cannot. We can also help cover costs of money managers for victims and other types of victims' needs. We can coordinate evaluations and coordinate with state and local authorities to identify whether a guardianship should be pursued, whether there are some other alternatives to a guardianship that might make sense for a victim. We address cases that come to us from our core members, from members of the community. We get our referrals really from everywhere.
And for anyone on this who's from King County, if you have a case that's sort of fallen through the cracks or where you're frustrated by a lack of response by law enforcement and or by APS, feel free to reach out to Eileen and me, and we will talk to you about it, and we can bring it to the MDT if that seems appropriate.
And if you are not from King County, ask your local prosecutor's office, your local adult protective services. See if there is a multidisciplinary team in your area. We're not the only one out there.
There aren't many, but there are a couple.
And you could start one. We also, in terms of responding to scams, we have seen an increase in collaboration between federal and local law enforcement agencies, at least in Western Washington. And there's really an increased focus on elder scams by the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office. We'll talk a little bit about how to report these things. I know that was a question that came in through the chat. And an increased collaboration between local law enforcement and federal investigators and prosecutors in terms of looking at the larger scams that are kind of larger operations and larger enterprises, and making sure that when local law enforcement identifies that, they're moving that up to a federal level.
And I've been doing this work for about 20 years, and I have never seen the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office here more engaged and more focused in this problem. I'm very hopeful it will continue. I'm worried, but it's been an amazing contrast between this and this, as far as this U.S. Attorney is concerned, we've had recently in Washington in prior years. So we're hopeful this will continue.
So we're going to talk a little bit about what we think you might be able to do to address scams and report scams. And the first is consider the possibility that your patient, your client, that elder person is suffering from some kind of financial exploitation or abuse or neglect. As we saw before in the earlier slides, 50% of patients with dementia will experience some kind of abuse in their lifetime. Financial exploitation, abuse, or neglect might be a possible explanation for what you're saying. I know that physicians are often trained about bruising and identifying whether a bruise might be from physical assault versus the kind of frequent story about, oh, I fell. But there may be other signs of other types of abuse, like the financial exploitation, that may be present that you're not identifying as that red flag. Some of the other identifying red flags are, as we mentioned, if the elder has overdue bills, it's an unusual thing for them. Missed appointments, decline in self-care. There's always a concern, at least from my perspective, a concern when the elder has a brand new friend or romantic interest that is unusually involved in the elder's life, or suddenly involved in the elder's life, and significant changes in the elder's financial activity. There are scams that rely heavily on bank wires. They rely on gift cards and making purchases of gift cards and then giving the numbers over the phone. Purchases of Bitcoin or precious metals, large cash withdrawals, and secretive phone calls and emails, especially when that is unusual for that elder person.
Okay. So
another thing you can do is to document those concerns. We talked a little bit about the medical records of Mariana's PCP, who actually had some noted red flags, but didn't recognize them, and then didn't record a number of the other kind of red flags that were present. So if you see signs of cognitive impairment, you see obviously signs of physical abuse or neglect, if you identify those red flags, those appointments, those decline in self-care, make note of those. I would also, it's important to, as hard as it is to think that a caregiver might be exploiting or scamming that elder, that certainly happens. And so making note of behavior changes of a caregiver, and making note of the patient's statements and the caregiver's statements if you suspect any kind of abuse, neglect, or exploitation.
we scrutinize any medical records we end up getting, and we get them on really every case, regardless of whether it's physical or sexual abuse or financial exploitation. And if there are unusual statements a patient makes, those are admissible at trial, even if the patient is no longer available to testify or the dementia is too severe that they can't testify. If there are concerning statements by a caregiver who may be exploiting the patient, and they make statements to the doctor or the nurse or social worker, those statements can also come in. So they're really, I can't emphasize enough how important they are for us to assess whether a case is criminal, and if it is criminal, to prove that case at trial.
Another thing you can do is, if there are the signs of cognitive impairment, get an assessment. Find those reliable screening tests. And a reminder that the emergency is not of huge value in that arena.
And we would also just encourage you to report, obviously, if you're mandatory reporters, to both APS and law enforcement. But there's some other places to report to that we've put here for your information, which are scam specific. The IC3 is run by the FBI and is an amazing resource because whenever they get a complaint about internet crime, they coordinate with all the other complaints they're getting across the country, and occasionally they're actually able to save someone's money from going overseas. So that's a really important place to report to. Also, the FTC has a great reporting system for fraud. And then report to the victim's bank if you're in a position to do that, because they have the ability to freeze the funds and refuse to turn over money, even if the victim is saying they want this money to be turned over, where they have evidence that the victim is being exploited. So again, they also have the power to stop the exploitation. There was a question about banks.
Mm-hmm. That there was a question about whether banks have a fiduciary duty, just like a power of attorney has a fiduciary duty to only use the funds of that of the principal for the benefit of the principal. And fiduciary duty is banks do not have a fiduciary duty, an affirmative fiduciary duty. There are some types of investment professionals that do have a fiduciary duty. Banks are not one of those. However, there are mandatory reporting laws that may or may not impact banks. And there are other financial reporting laws that do impact banks about suspicious activity. And of course, if someone is coming in and wiring hundreds of thousands of dollars all of a sudden without ever having sent a wire ever before, that would certainly fall under suspicious activity, and banks are obligated to report that suspicious activity, but they do not have a fiduciary duty. And they have some ability to do some things like freeze an account or not send a wire, but they're understandably concerned about their own liability in those situations. And they may or may not comply with someone's wishes to hold off on sending a wire or hold off on completing a transaction.
And in California, there are mandatory reporters of financial exploitation. That was attempted in Washington and it failed, but they are permissive reporters, so they can report a situation to the police and APS, and they're not liable if they're reporting.
And that's the benefit of the mandatory reporting laws, right? It is an obligation to report, but it also provides some protection for that person who's reporting, as long as they do so in good faith.
And I think there's also a lot of pessimism about, as I think I mentioned earlier, about our ability to do anything about scams. And this is something that is changing along with our sort of increased collaboration with the federal government. But we're also learning is that many of these scams involve a local actor. Like the woman who was calling people and telling them they were being defrauded by their bank was here in King County. And so the detective had the wherewithal to do a search warrant of her home, and it was in her home that she found this phone book with the numbers circled of these people whose names sounded like they were old, and then pages and pages of notes of all of these different people's social security numbers and account numbers and names and dates of birth. And from those pages of notes that she found when she executed that search warrant, we were able to reach out to those victims and build a case and charge her and send her to prison. So it is possible. Eileen has a case where someone was a courier for a scammer who we think was probably not in the United States. And the Renton police were incredibly tenacious, and they were able to figure out what this person was doing and catch him in the act. And Eileen was able to charge him and just got a bunch of information from him, which they're going to be able to use to catch some other scammers. in Washington. So it's pretty exciting that we're starting to be able to do something in the, on these cases. And what we also know is that even if we can't do anything about catching these scammers, which is certainly true of the majority of them, we've got to protect people who are being scammed. And that means, educating them on scams and on money management, usually changing their emails and phone numbers. And then if they do have dementia that is significant, talking about managing their finances for them, or filing for conservatorship, or having somebody become their power of attorney and handle their finances. Because as Eileen said, their name's out there. Once they're victimized, they're going to be victimized again and again and again. So we've got to also kind of stop the bleeding and prevent them from being exploited by helping them, not be protected basically from these scammers. So that's all we have. And I know we have some questions. So Barb, you want to help us out with the questions?
Sure. I was going to start off by saying James earlier on mentioned, although not as egregious as many of the other more costly scams, he's appalled by the exploitation of elders by insurance brokers during Medicare open enrollment period. And does this get some attention because it can cause lapses in coverage and that sort of thing? Do you ever deal with that sort of issue?
We haven't.
It's not criminal. I mean, there's nothing, we've never gotten a criminal referral on that. I think it's more of a consumer protection issue. Mm-hmm. So the AG's office may well be dealing with that, but
no, except that my dear father, who is himself an elder, gets a lot of calls, a lot of scam calls during Medicare enrollment. A lot of calls.
Yeah.
And Barb, you said you were going to have a presentation on that. Is that right?
Yeah, well, we're going to have, we're finalizing the schedule for spring, and one of those is going to be focused on Medicare, and it's hopefully somebody who works with Washington, the Sheba group that addresses some of these sort of Medicare enrollment kinds of issues. So that person, although not focused on scams, may have some experience or perspectives on that very question.
Great.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat. I'm going to just jump in here about information or experience with patients with mild cognitive impairment as victims. That is often the victim that comes to us. It's not necessarily a full-on diagnosis of dementia, but it's the cognitive impairment that, again, brings down people's defenses, and they're not able to recognize the red flags of a scam, or are not able to process the information, take the information in, process it, and be able to analyze it like they once were, and they take someone's word for something rather than being able to determine whether or not it really sounds legit.
And they often lack financial capacity in that early course of dementia already. So they're not really tracking their finances. I think Mariana certainly did not have financial capacity anymore when she was exploited. So she wasn't really able to put together what was happening to her money, the impact that these checks were having on her future and on the finances. And that's really common with a lot of our victims. So it's really, I would say the majority of our cases are the elder is living alone. They're usually widowed or single, or for whatever reason are alone in life, and they have mild cognitive impairment, or some are in the early stages of dementia and are undiagnosed. So there's been no protection for them put into place, and no one's really aware of how vulnerable they are, except for the person who's exploiting them. And it's just amazing how common those cases are for us.
Margaret brought up an interesting point about that although letter carriers are frequently reassigned, many of them are potentially seeing mail piling up. That might be a red flag. Do those kinds of things get reported?
I've never heard of that. It's a great idea. I've never heard of that or gotten a report of that, but I think it'd be wonderful to do an elder abuse training for them.
Yeah. So Diana had asked, are there funds available through crime victims advocate offices for victims of these kinds of financial scams?
No, there are not. And I've heard like Vermont maybe doing that, but I don't think many states in the country are doing that. And it's very much needed. And we have crime victim compensation that helps people who are victims of violent crimes, but not thefts and financial exploitation. So for almost all of these victims, once that money is gone, it's gone. Eileen and I, when we negotiate cases, the first thing we try to do is to get the victim's money back, because that's always what they want more than anything. So we will incentivize the defendant as far as how much, prison time they're looking at. We will reduce their sentence if they're able to repay the victim. But almost always the money is gone. So it's really a rare case that we can get their money back.
Interesting.
And it's pretty good.
Cindy had asked if there's resources or role plays around about how to have conversations to introduce vulnerable populations to risks and raise awareness about scams without scaring them unnecessarily. And you may be aware, Paige and Eileen, but I also would encourage others who are attending, if you know of resources and want to put a link in the chat, that would be great too.
I mean, I know that FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office are doing trainings and going into long-term care facilities to do trainings and to senior centers. We've also done those in our office. But I think online is a good place to look. I think the FTC has really good prevention information, and ARP probably does as well. But it's a good point. We need to be doing a lot more of that.
Well, and Margaret raised that point about, are there ways for AARP to send simple messages to cue people about scams? The dilemma is who has access gets those messages, but it's something for those of you that might be involved with AARP to think about.
And they have a very active fraud fighters group. So I know they're doing quite a bit on that, but as far as what they're doing prevention wise, I'm not sure, but that'd be a great group to talk to about it. They certainly.
So here's a question. I'm not sure whether you want to tackle it, but someone asked, do you feel that older adults might be more vulnerable than others when it comes to contractor scams for those being affected by the LA wildfires or other disasters, which we haven't experienced as much as in Washington State, but certainly in Eastern Washington we have. I'm not sure if those kinds of issues have come up.
I just saw today when I was looking online at the ARP website that I saw, I don't know if it was on that website or another one, they were talking about the disaster scams and how they're like scams will spring up after disasters like the LA wildfires, and people will take advantage of people. And I just think, if they're lucky enough to get an older person, they're going to be oftentimes more likely to be victimized because of this loneliness and dementia, these factors. They're more likely, if they're in their 80s or 90s, to be alone in life, and they're more likely to have dementia, both of which make them extremely vulnerable. But certainly younger people are being victimized as well. I just think the rate of older adults is much higher.
Mm-hmm. And again, that's where most of the wealth is held by the older population. And so if that's where the money is, then that's where people are going to target. There was we were told that some of these online scammers are purposely putting in spelling errors and grammar errors into their emails, into their messages to people, because they are trying to identify people who might have cognition issues and don't recognize that the spelling errors are a red flag, that this email might be a scam, because they're easier to target. They're easier to extract money from. It's a way they screen people out who are not going to fall for their scam by putting in intentionally putting in errors in their emails and seeing who responds to them. So I think in any type of scam, elders are particularly vulnerable and particularly targeted. And I think that goes for the disaster recovery kind of scams.
Mm-hmm.
Well, but again, anyone can fall for one. Anyone can fall for a scam. It depends on if the scam is tailored to you or not.
Well, it was interesting what you said about purposefully putting in, like cues that should have been caught but weren't, and so then they target those people who didn't pick them up. And I'm wondering about Um, I think Nicole brought up considerations related to living in rural areas, people with limited resources, people who have experienced a recent death in the family, so obituaries are posted. Any, do you want to elaborate on any experiences you've had with those kinds of considerations or flags that get picked up?
I think in rural areas, an elder, particularly an elder who has mobility issues, can be particularly isolated and can be vulnerable to the scammer who's going to befriend them. I don't have any statistics, or I don't know if there's been much research in that area, but I do think that there are particular vulnerabilities for the rural community.
And scammers definitely know to look for people who are alone. So widowed people are going to be more likely to be targeted.
Mm-hmm. It was helpful for you to share, since there are people from all over the Northwest and actually other parts of the United States, it was helpful for you to share where reporters might go, or people who are concerned might go if there's not an office like your office there. I'm wondering, so this relates somewhat to my goal of having some interprofessional interaction. For those of you who are not mandatory reporters, who do you connect with when you have issues or concerns about a particular client? And feel free to share your discipline and or your setting. And perhaps Paige or Eileen, you might have some additional perspectives on that as well, related to people who are not mandatory reporters, but and so might not have gotten, the background in their basic programs, I guess. So May brings up anybody can report to APS, not just reporters. That's a really good point. Thoughts about Paige or Eileen? What are maybe things that should be said or covered in those kinds of reports to APS?
Well, remember that APS is there to do the investigation for you. You don't have to do the investigation. You don't have to be 100% sure that something is going on. If you suspect something is going on, notify your state APS so that they can do the investigation. If they think that something might be criminal, they're obligated to notify local law enforcement, but you can also notify local law enforcement. You don't have to do the investigation. And that's oftentimes the biggest hurdle to reporting or bringing other people in on the conversation is if you see something, particularly for someone who otherwise is isolated, you may be the only person who sees it. So putting eyes on the problem in front of the right people is really important, and don't feel like you have to be 100% sure that something's happening in order to report it.
The other thing is that I think a common thing that can happen in cases of people with early dementia or mild cognitive impairment is that APS would get a report and then screen the person out because they determine they're not a vulnerable adult. So if you have a patient or a client who you think has dementia and you're seeing something go on, make sure you give as much information as you can to APS that is evidence of the fact that they have cognitive impairment, because I think it's so easy for them. They still are not consistent about what kind of screening they're doing. So some of them still use the MRSE or don't do any screening tests at all. And they'll go out and talk to the alleged victim and see that their house is clean, like Mariana, they're articulate and well-spoken, and the victim denies that anything's going on, and so they just close their case. In fact, in Mariana's case, APS closed the case because they just determined she wasn't a vulnerable adult. So if you have information you can provide that is evidence of their vulnerability, make sure you give that to them. The other thing is that besides APS, there's also the AAA. Every county has a AAA, Area Agency on Aging. And at least in King County, our AAA has a really good case management program for older adults who are being victimized. They also have other sort of resources for support for people. So that's another place I would turn to if APS doesn't have the services that I need, or if they turn down the case.
Thanks for bringing that up. I think Mary Pat O'Leary from AAA was on, although I think she's had to sign off at this point, but certainly the King County AAA and the AAAs all over Washington State, and there's AAA, a AAA covers every region in the United States, and so just take a look for that.
Yes.
We are approaching the end of our time. If there are any other questions or comments, May's question. Let me see if I can find that. You said anybody can report to APS, not just reporters. Is that what you mean?
Yes, anyone can report to APS.
Yeah. And I thought it was interesting that you brought up that the case of Mariana really was reported to 911 and it still got to the appropriate channels.
Right. And that's another thing. Even if APS doesn't respond, or if they screen the case out, still report it to the police if you think it's criminal. If someone's losing a lot of money, report it to the police. And they take cases regardless of whether someone's a vulnerable adult. It's still fast. So make sure to report to them.
So if an elder with cognitive issues gets caught up in a romance scam that involved them cashing a check and sending it bank fraud, how can they get help? And will they be prosecuted as well if they've gotten caught up in something that they didn't realize?
Yeah. So there is we have seen a lot of what we refer to as money mules, who are, I think this is what the person with the question is getting at, where the elder is actually used as a part of this kind of money laundering scheme, where there's illegal funds that are obtained from somewhere and are sent to the elder, and the elder is instructed to cash the check or deposit this check and then wire the money out. And so they're really a funnel for this illegal activity. It is a money laundering is a crime, but if the person if the elder is unaware of what is happening and is being duped, and especially in the kind of romance scam world, it's not something that we're going to prosecute. It's something that we will follow up on, because there may be additional victims out there, maybe additional kind of a network, a criminal network that's happening. And they may play a part in terms of shutting down that network. So they're going to probably be involved in that way.
And the same is true with the FBI. They just usually write the person a letter and warn them. But oftentimes that person also is lonely and needs support, so that they're not continuing to be victimized and have to participate.
And it's sometimes hard for the elder to believe that the online relationship that they were in, that they have fallen in love with this person, is using them and is not who they say they are. And when there is a warning of that type and the elder continues that conduct, that gets into a trickier territory for us.
Paige and Eileen, thank you so much. This was so informative, as you can see from the comments. Very important information, kind of concerning and distressing to learn about the case scenarios, but it's important for us to know that this is happening and that there's channels that we can go to try to help people address these issues. Thank you very, very much. Everyone have a good week, and I will see you next week.
Thank you, Barb. I appreciate it.
So I'm just hanging on to collect the comments, but that's okay.
If there's anything else we can do, Barb, let us know. Yeah. And people really should not hesitate to reach out to us.
Thank you very, very much. Okay. Really appreciate your expertise.
Okay. Take care, Barb. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.